Hello and welcome to this live stream where we're discussing teen tech use. It's a complex problem. There's so many different opinions that we hear all the time. I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's discussion with Carrie and Emily that I'm going to introduce in a little bit. My name is David Ryan Polgar. I'm the founder and director of the nonprofit called All Tech is Human. If you are unfamiliar with us, welcome to what we're doing. We're an organization based in New York, founded in 2018, that's committed to co-creating a better tech future. We do that through a wide range of activities around multi-stakeholder collaboration, community building, multidisciplinary education, and diversifying the traditional tech pipeline with more backgrounds, disciplines, and lived experiences. But I'm going to just introduce the amazing guests that we have on today, Emily and Carrie. So we have Dr. Carrie James and Dr. Emily Weinstein. They're principal investigators at Project Zero, which is based at Harvard Graduate School of Education. They have been working for over a decade on these really thorny issues and leading research about youth and technology, what we're talking about today. They're also the co-authors of the newly released book, Behind Their Screens, What Teens Are Facing and Adults Are Missing. They've done some incredible research, and it sounds like adults might be missing a lot. I also want to mention that both Carrie and Emily are parents, and will work into their own perspectives and how that influences their kind of overall perception about youth and technology. So Carrie and Emily, welcome to All Tech is Humans live stream.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us, David.
So you two are a tag team, so you're both in sync, even with how you respond. You respond as one symbiotic person. So I love this, and I love just all of the work that you've been doing, kind of in this area. I know we've had a lot of chances to collaborate, especially around kind of the HX work that's trying to reimagine this kind of digital space in our relationship with technology. So I want to definitely applaud you for that work. So I'm trying to butter you up because I do have a bunch of hard questions. The first hard question with your new book, Behind Their Screens, right? What teens are facing and adults are missing. You kind of interviewed and looked at research from over 3,500 teens around kind of their tech use. So I'd love to kind of start out with either Carrie or Emily, who wants to jump in first. What were kind of your major takeaways, and also what's your motivation for kind of having this posing question?
Okay, well, maybe I'll start with a little bit about our motivation. So I'm a psychologist, Carrie's a sociologist. We have been studying teens and tech, as you mentioned, for a little over a decade. And we had this really incredible opportunity to collect data and really hear perspectives about what it looks and feels like to grow up with technology from thousands of teens from all different contexts and backgrounds across the US. And we just felt like we had this absolute treasure trove of pain points and opportunities and perspectives that were really from the mouths of babes. And Carrie and I started looking through the data, and we realized that even as people who had been thinking about technology day in and day out for so many years, we were forced to rethink our own assumptions. The stories and the things we were hearing were just so interesting to us and compelling. We were seeing changes in how social media was intersecting with young people's civic participation, how they were grappling with questions about cancel culture, how they were thinking about performative activism and how that connected to their different identities, how they were navigating a change in culture around sexting, how they were thinking about their tech habits as new features and platforms were on the scene. And so, obviously it's not surprising in some ways because our world has changed so much and the technologies we're using have evolved so much. But we really started feeling over these last few years like there were new stories that we were hearing, and we felt like we had this opportunity to just be messengers and help other people hear teen stories and see that, teens are not a monolith. They're not having some one universal experience with tech. And when we dig into the details and hear what their experiences are like, we are in such better positions to understand their pain points and then to think about interventions.
I'd be curious, since you mentioned kind of like sexting, that's obviously always a major topic of media fascination. There's been a lot of changes, even in the law. It's very similar to how we think of the what's called like the Romeo and Juliet exemption, how you think about sexual kind of relationships. But early on with sexting, right, it kind of seemed like the quote unquote adult reaction was, oh my God, teens are going to destroy the reputation, or my child is going to be thrown in jail because the laws haven't kind of caught up to that. So I guess, Carrie, I pose to you is, how do you kind of deal with that gulf sometimes between this kind of parent reaction, which is oftentimes protective of a child or children, to say, I don't want them to not be able to get into the college of their choice, or I don't want them to get thrown in jail if that's the way that the laws in certain states were written, versus how do we create an empowering environment for teens to utilize technology?
Well, I think it's such a great question, and we have a lot more to say about all those topics. Sexting is its own 45-minute or longer conversation. So is digital footprints, but it really, how do we get parents and adults to understand what's complicated? I mean, one of the things that we heard high level when we slowed down and listened carefully to teens is they actually share a lot of adults' worries about growing up in this connected world. They're very alert, especially older teens, but we even heard from 12 and 13-year-olds about being hyper alert to the risks associated with one's digital footprint, for example. Even being worried about their digital habits and feeling dysregulated and realizing that the pull to the screen was strong and they didn't always want to be pulled there, but they struggled to kind of step away and regain some control. So that top level headline is really important. We often assume that teens want, 24/7 access to digital content, or that they're not aware of the risks associated with sending nudes, for example, or putting out, an inappropriate photo, and the fact that it could come back to haunt you later in life. They are keenly attuned to those risks, but the details are much more complicated. The reasons why they may not have a perfectly polished digital footprint, even while being alert to those risks, are super complicated. They're navigating social pressures and pulls and immediate concerns that feel much more weighty than uncertain down the road potential consequences. Their developmental sensitivities play a big role too. Emily's a developmental psychologist. I'm a sociologist. So together our partnership, bringing those disciplinary lenses, has been really powerful, but just sort of tuning into the reality that they are primed to express themselves, and social media provide tremendous avenues for that. And they're primed to really care about immediate peer feedback and seek validation. And when it comes to something like digital footprints, the reality is that they're literally out of their control in a world where we can all co-author one another's footprints. Adults play a role in putting out pictures of their kids online, and their peers certainly do too. So it's much more multi-layered, and teens are much more alert to the complexities than we imagine. And once we realize that, then I think we can approach our conversations and the supports question from a different place.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you said about privacy, right? Because kind of globally, different countries deal with that, differently. Like a country like France has much more kind of youth privacy. So there would be certain ramifications for parents to share their children's photos once they kind of grow up. They say, wait a minute, now my digital footprint wasn't based on my own kind of volition. But since you opened up that kind of Pandora's box of digital footprints, I've got a lot to say and ask about that for Carrie and for Emily. Since you've been kind of studying this as kind of leading researchers for over a decade now, if we think back a decade ago, you saw the rise of Snapchat and the company Snap, right? What I always found intriguing, because I've been involved in this space for a decade, is that early on in this kind of digital citizenship type of field, you had a lot of advocates saying, be careful what you post. And we can talk about the grandmother rule and things like that a lot of organizations were pushing out, and advocates. But you also saw this idea of saying, be really mindful of what you post. But then on the flip side, when a platform like Snapchat came out to promise a limitation of one's digital footprint, that seemingly would be a positive from like the parent's perspective of a lower digital footprint for their son or daughter. But then the adult reaction to the rise of Snapchat was, oh my God, now I don't know what my teenage child is posting. Therefore, I don't like this idea that it's not permanent, because now I can't track it. Right. So it seemed to be in my brain, I was like, well, that's a little bit of like a, damned if you do, damned if you don't type of scenario, where we're telling teens, don't post something that's going to negatively affect your reputation, and almost treating sometimes teens like brands, which personally I'm kind of against, because brands, you're paid to be a brand, and most teenagers are not paid. So you have that kind of unpaid labor aspect of it too, but also just this kind of, well, then what should I do? If you don't want me to post something that negatively affects my reputation, but then I'm using a platform that lessens that ability, now you're still upset. So I'd be curious from your reaction to something like that, because I'm sure you're kind of following all the twists and turns, and even right now with the trend around kind of be real, and how that's shifting a little bit of the conversation with teen tech use.
Yeah, you named so many important and interesting tensions, and this like puzzle around the pros and cons of ephemerality and like what it means that posts don't continue are so interesting. So Carrie and I did a lot of thinking when we were doing this book with teens about what it feels like to even be in a, let's just say in a classroom where a teacher or an adult who you really respect and trust is just repeating again and again, your digital footprint is a tattoo for life. Be careful what you post. It can come back to haunt you. And maybe you're sitting there and you're thinking about things you've already texted or posts you've already sent, and you're wondering, have I already ruined my future? Or you're thinking about how hard it is in practice to control what your friends are recording or posting about you and tagging you in. And we really, I think, came to appreciate that there are so many ways that teens, like rightly so, don't feel totally in control of their digital footprints. And yet so many of the messages from adults just double down on this idea that you should be able to control it. And if you're responsible, you're thinking critically, and you're really taking control over making sure that you have this positive digital footprint. And yet in this kind of record everything, collect receipts culture, where also peers are co-authors of your digital footprint, you're not as in control of your perfect online digital footprint as some of those messages assume.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area, because as you well know, then that causes like a cottage industry of reputation management companies, which come in to kind of monetize the fact that the teenagers are really struggling, and adults as well, with their reputation. I don't need to mention like the Justine Sacco, you have lots of famous examples of reputations. But we do have a very interesting question around gender, specifically for posting, which I want to bring up from Adam. The question is, did you see any gender differences among male and female identifying teens regarding how they perceive the risks of having a nude photo or video shared without their consent? Fascinating question, right? Because it kind of really deals with this idea of when we're overly protectionistic, let's say towards a female, is that society taking this kind of like, we need to be really careful of a fragile teen female, and treating it in a way that's not really empowering. And then I'm be curious too, even of just how we treat the concept of sexting based on gender. So Carrie or Emily, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll jump in first, and then we have a lot to say about sexting. But first of all, I just want to appreciate the framing of the question. So much of the time, we focus on people, like, don't send a nude. And we really focus on the individual who sent the nude without really recognizing that that decision to send is often nested in contexts where there are a lot of pressures, even explicit pressures, implicit pressures, or like desires and wants in the context of a trusting, consensual relationship. So sexting is super complicated. And I really appreciate that the question focuses on forwarding or sharing someone's nude without their consent, because that to teens is the ultimate violation. And teens told us that they're really frustrated that the discourse about sexting gets caught up in the person who originally sent a nude, with less emphasis on those who less emphasis on the ethics of forwarding or sharing to a broad audience. And this is a big oversight and a recommendation from teens that our conversations need to move in the direction where the onus is really on what, that lack of consent, that lack of respect, that
Mhm.
true violation that exists when something is shared with a larger audience. Not that there isn't need to attend to some of the pressures, and especially when someone feels that they have been in some ways threatened or blackmailed into sharing something, we need supports at all different levels of the conversation. Emily, what would you add on this topic?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question too. I mean, this was an area where for sure we saw gender dynamics playing out, which I think makes sense when you think about our broader social and cultural context and often the more severe ramifications for girls and women when pictures are leaked, for example.
Mhm.
I will say we heard a loud and very clear plea from teen girls in particular around what Carrie's describing. Please tell parents of teen boys to tell them not to ask us for nudes, not
Mhm.
just to focus the entire intervention on not sending nudes. And actually, I think the ways that we adults often react when a nude gets leaked can sort of backfire in ways that we don't really intend, because we say things like, see, like someone's picture gets leaked and we might say to our kids, like, see, that's why you should never ever send a picture. Like, it could get leaked, it could ruin your reputation. And in a way, teens can hear the message that it's really the person's own fault for even
Mhm.
taking the picture or sending it in the first place. And that can make them actually feel more empowered and okay sending on that picture, forwarding it on when they receive it, because, hey, it's your fault for not
Mm.
being more protective of yourself in the first place. Whereas if we shift the messaging a little and we talk about how absolutely unacceptable it is to forward someone's nude picture without their consent under any circumstances ever, like, we've really just pivoted the ways
Yeah.
we think and talk about the intervention. And then kind of by definition, the ways people feel and respond when something goes wrong.
No, it's a great framing, Emily. And then I'm going to bring up a related question that we have from Tessa around kind of setting boundaries, but just a little bit of commentary around what you're talking about with perception of are we blaming kind of the original kind of victim of this non-consensual photo, or are we putting the onus on the person and the ethics behind sharing? It really reminds me of the new, I think it's on Netflix, around the rise of Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee, which, if you go back, is actually one of the original kind of like viral, sexual content types of videos, even before Kim Kardashian, right? So what was interesting about that framing is when it actually happened in society, we kind of looked towards Pamela Anderson and society kind of relatively blamed her. Whereas now in hindsight, there's a whole kind of recontextualization of what happened, because we look at the fact that this was a private VHS video of their intimate honeymoon that was stolen from their private property, right, by a handyman, and then publicized without their knowledge or consent. So the question I'm going to bring up from Tessa really talks about this idea. If we view it as something that is bound to happen, right? So it's your overall recommendations for parents remind me a lot of sex education. Abstinence only education doesn't work. This is Tessa Brown. We have to engage with the realities of how teens really behave. Could you discuss more of how you're centering teens' agency and their right to privacy and set boundaries?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And so, yes, we write in the book about the connections that we started seeing so clearly to abstinence only education. It's really interesting. There has been a broader conversation and a push by some sexting scholars and people who do research on sexting. Every time I say that, someone in the audience is like, sexting scholars? But yes, really, this is a super important area of research. But there has been a push among some people who are really close to young people's experiences for safer sexting education. And I want to say a word about what that might mean, and also why it's actually a little complicated in our current context, which is just a reality that Carrie and I have been kind of grappling with. As we think about this agency question. So the idea of safer sexting would be, instead of just saying, don't ever send a sext, teaching strategies like, if you are going to send a sext at some point, you really need to make sure that your face is not in the picture, that there's no identifying information in the background, that you're not including any data that would show where you are or where you go to, there's not like a school sweatshirt in the background or whatever it is. And there are people who think actually like pivoting the conversation towards those kinds of strategies and recommendations could be really effective. And there are ways that we heard from teens that they're already doing that in their own communities to different extents. And, certainly like on TikTok, there have been videos about like, how should you try and keep yourself safe if you're going to send sexy images? One of the reasons this is really complicated in our current context is because there's this super varied legal landscape in the United States. And, cyberbullying.org actually has a really cool like interactive map where I think they just updated it this last summer, where you can hover over a state and see their sexting, and they do it for sexting and cyberbullying, I think, but you can actually see that state's laws. But one of the problems is that right now, without any totally consistent legal precedent, there are places where so much is left to discretion of the person prosecuting or investigating. And so we appreciate that there are instances where teaching safer sexting might then put a young person in a position where they're actually taking a picture of themselves and then being told they've created or distributed child pornography. Of course, so these considerations, I think, just weigh on our shoulders as we think about what it might look like, particularly in the US context right now, to do the kinds of things that we hear about that would be more agency and sort of like boundary affirming for teens. But Kara, maybe you should say a word about some of the strategies we heard from teens around how they're trying to take more agency.
I'd love to hear that.
Right. I mean, in many cases, void where there's not a discussion about safer sexting practices, for better or for worse, we heard some really interesting things, especially from teen girls, around how they're navigating this context, where in some cases, saying no to a request for a nude can feel really hard. So they told us about things like using Google search to find body parts that could potentially look like theirs, screenshotting them to send them as their nude, but prior to doing so, vetting with their friends so that their friends knew, and their friends also had a receipt that indicated, yes, I see, I can verify, I can back you up and say that this was from a Google search, this was not your nude. So that's one strategy. Another really interesting one is watermarking nudes. So this is where teen girls told us about putting a tiny, barely visible watermark on the nude that they're sending to someone with the name of the person that they're sending it to. So barely visible. So the person who receives it doesn't necessarily notice it, but if they forward it on, the girl knows it's there, and they can also be implicated if it gets spread to a wider audience. So it's almost like a little bit of an insurance policy to make sure that it's not just me who receives the blame. This person is brought along for that ride.
Yeah, it's almost like sending end to end, like it's for your eyes only, and then you can tell, right, if it goes outside of that. Sorry, Emily.
Yeah. One other thing I was just going to say that I think one way that we saw that agency can feel compromised, especially this was something that seemed especially relevant for younger, like middle school aged girls, was feeling pressure to send a picture when you don't want to, but you can't figure out how to say no. And so actually, and especially if you like the person that the requests are coming from, like how do you navigate that space? And just recognizing that actually one way to build agency is to help, and it's not just girls, but to help teens have strategies for how they manage that communication when the inbounds come in. So one thing that we heard, for example, was like a teen being told by a mentor, if someone asks you for a nude, just send a screenshot of a black screen and say like, this is me naked in the dark. That seems like the most basic intervention. You're like, that's an intervention to tell a teen that, but actually if that teen then feels like, okay, I have a strategy I can use so that I can feel more in control, so that I can set and hold a boundary that is important to me, then that's actually an agency building really interesting and effective intervention. So looking for those and thinking about what do teens need to feel like they can make decisions that are more empowered, that do stay true to whatever, however they want to navigate these situations, and then helping them develop the language and the strategies, and knowing that those best strategies often come from other teens. So for adults, I think creating spaces where teens can have these conversations with each other is super powerful.
So Carrie and Emily, we're going to go to the double jeopardy round and make this a little more complex. See, a great question. Actually, I have a bunch of questions we want to get through if possible.
Okay.
One from Jennifer. So great to see Jennifer again. Interested to hear your thoughts on school involvement in this regarding educating students and parents. I'll just add a little context, just in my own perspective. You when you're talking to all these groups, right, you have like, what's the teen kind of perspective? What's the parent perspective? But wait, what should educators do? But wait, how do educators interact with the administration? And then what are the lawyers saying to the administration, right? So you have all these different parts. And even when you think about the very concept of being a teacher, right, it's like in locus parentis in place of a parent. So the way we even set up a teacher relationship was supposed to be the time period the child gets sent over to school, and the teacher is acting in some kind of concept of a parental type of relationship. And I think where it seems like everyone is struggling, all stakeholders are saying, well, there's no boundary anymore. There's a blurring between what's a school activity and what's a home activity. So I've seen firsthand how many times a school gets involved with an after school activity because it interacts with a school type of environment, because images are shared, people are talking at the lunch table, right? So be very curious for you both, Carrie and Emily, your perspective on what the school's kind of responsibility and what educators can do.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that, well, A, I appreciate the question. And two, David, you're absolutely right that, I mean, it's really unavoidable. And, as part of our research, we also interviewed educators, and we are regularly talking with school administrators about issues related to digital life. So nudes being spread around, issues of bullying, all kinds of things that make their way. There's this spillover effect. So even if it takes place, even if an incident takes place, like a fight, for example, between classmates over a holiday break in the winter, when the kids come back to school, there is spillover in the hallways and in the classrooms at school. So it is unavoidable that schools have to navigate and face this. And so, and that doesn't mean parents are off the hook. So, I mean, really, really takes a village in so many different ways. We've been really fortunate to be able to do work on classroom materials. So we've collaborated for a very long time with Common Sense Media and Common Sense Education. And our research has directly informed the resources that they make available in their free digital literacy and citizenship curriculum. And specifically over the past few years, really brought to Common Sense content from our research and our interviews about the dilemmas that young people face, these really thorny situations that come up for them in digital life that they need much more support around, and much more nuanced support rather than just don't sext. We need to look at some of the complicated dilemmas and pressures that teens can feel. So that's a big part of it, really creating materials and resources and providing the PD so that educators feel equipped to navigate these conversations that often are about contexts and apps that they may not have familiarity with, and they don't need familiarity with the ins and outs of the apps, but they do need to understand some of the dilemmas that young people are facing and wade into them with them, and know that they have some wisdom to bring as adults from life in general. Emily, would you add anything about that?
I can, but David, do you want to?
I was just going to say, it just reminded me of some of the commentary from Diana Graber, who runs CyberWise. And I saw this in a lot of the comments that we received for today's discussion, that people feel like they can't keep up. Right? It's like, this is my life. It's like nobody can keep up. So if I can't keep up with the latest trend, how can a parent who has a full-time job outside of this and other concerns, how can they keep up? Whereas what Diana Graber was saying, which always kind of stuck with me years later, is this idea that the tech is always going to change, but that's not necessarily the important part. It's the social and behavioral skills that as an adult, you do have a heightened kind of perspective and kind of wisdom, so to speak, that you can share with a teen. But I want to bring up just this commentary. Whoops, it's blocking our faces, so I'll just read it off. The idea was a continuation, Carrie, on what you were saying around the education and curricula, and then specifically with both of your works with Common Sense Media, which has kind of a well-known digital citizenship type of curriculum that is widely used. So this question from Dawn was getting at how how can tech advocates help young adults better understand these overall platforms that they're utilizing, and also lobby the Department of Education for a curriculum change. And I will quickly mention, since this does come up a lot, I think the interesting part from an American perspective is that our education system, as you both well know, is a lot more kind of decentralized than other countries. So, I've been involved with digital citizenship for years, and the struggle always seems to be this kind of slow pace of moving out digital citizenship type of curricula, because it's not something where it's like the United States is doing this, everybody, all schools are utilizing this. And I will also say that one of the things that always kind of rubbed me the wrong way was that I was getting asked to speak a lot to schools, to middle schools and high schools. But then I started noticing a trend is that they were all kind of, wealthy schools that were in Westchester County and beautiful parts of Connecticut. So it was fine for me as a speaker, but then I started realizing, well, wait a minute, does this mean that we're giving different access to education based on wealth? And as you well know, the research usually with tech use shows a certain kind of connection between families' relationship with their child and how close that relationship is, and then how that child is going to use tech use. And that's something that they found with the, everybody should receive an iPad, right? An iPad can be a tool for homework, or it can just be a distraction to play video games, right? So that has a spectrum. So I'd be curious, Carrie and Emily, your perspective from your work over the last decade in this around kind of education and what can be done in this area.
Okay, well, there's a lot there. Maybe we'll start with the first part, because I actually think it connects back to what you were just saying, which is like, what do we do as parents, as adults, as teachers, if we just can't keep up with the technologies as they change? And I will say something that has just been a really important, I think, cornerstone of the way that we have embrace this space is recognizing, first of all, we cannot keep up. Even though we actually are thinking about these issues, like this is our job. So we're not even doing this on the side. I can barely keep up with whatever I feel like I need to know in my parenting about the latest, parental controls that are relevant, particularly to my kid and the apps the apps that she's using or whatever it is. Curiosity has been the absolute best, I think, disposition for us as researchers and as adults wanting to support kids in this space. And when we lead with just a genuine curiosity about understanding what their experiences are like, we set ourselves up to hear from them about what's hard and why, and to understand what kinds of supports they might need. And I saw this really powerful metaphor from Lisa DeMora a couple of weeks ago, where she talked about this idea that for a lot of kids, if we just enter the conversation about tech, giving them advice on what they should be doing, it's kind of how you might feel if your kids came to you and said, Mom, Dad, I really want to give you some advice about your mortgage. Or you might be like, my mortgage? What do you know about mortgages? And you think about the difference between if your kid came to you and said, I want to talk to you and give you some advice about your mortgage, versus if they came to you and they were like, I have some questions about mortgages. You would have you'd be like, okay, of course you have questions about mortgages. Yeah, what can I tell you? How can I help you understand? And I think in a similar way, Carrie and I have found that when we ask questions of teens, when we're when we don't enter the classroom space or enter the space of being here are the 5 things you need to know, but we start the conversation by saying what do we need to know? Mm-hmm. We just learn so much. And then we also end up organically getting the opportunities to infuse the wisdom that is rooted in what we know is going on developmentally and what we know is important kind of socially and in the broader context.
I love that. Yeah. And I've always found just with every time I kind of interact with teens on kind of tech use, it always seems like there's such a change in the conversation when it shifts over to this kind of co-learning experience where that teen is like, oh, let me show you something. Let me teach you. And it's like, yes, I want to be a sponge. I mean, this is what we should be doing. But we have so many questions. So I would, if you don't mind, we'll get through a few of them. This one from Jeff. Both thanking you for the conversation today, but the question is around how parents can support teens when things do go wrong with a negative incident or impact to our teens' footprint. So that's very curious, right? So I think, Emily, you were saying earlier, this idea of this scarlet letter shaming that we oftentimes do in American society, where you seem to be in this public shaming type of part right now in American history. But what do you think the reaction should be? So let's imagine a scenario where a teen has some type of incident where whether it's some type of sexting type of scenario or some other type of partially kind of embarrassing situation. Like, what should the parent or parents or guardians kind of do in that situation? Is there a certain kind of advice that you have around showcasing kind of empathy and understanding?
I mean, that is absolutely the direction that we would lead towards. You know, we often get this question about advice around the digital footprint, especially because of what I shared earlier, which is that teens, by and large, are aware of the risks associated with their digital footprint. So if we keep parroting the same message, your digital footprint lasts forever, it's a tattoo for life, without giving them any practical guidance and without being there for them when they stumble, then we are so missing the mark and really not supporting them. So we definitely need to teach teens, especially younger teens, about risks, but we need to do more. We should expect and anticipate missteps. There are going to be mistakes and that are made. There are going to be things that get out there. And in certain cases, it may be that we can take some steps to get content taken down. This is a lot easier in other legal contexts, like in Europe, where there is the right to be forgotten, and there are ways in which content can be removed from search, although it's not perfect and there are limitations. So there's that. But I think what you were getting at, David, is really essential. We need to be there for our teens with a good dose of empathy and validation that, yeah, this is painful. But, you know, there are kind of steps that can be taken. In some cases, those steps might require making apologies if what was shared was deeply offensive, and attempting to make amends, really to kind of write the story for themselves and for others down the road of what happened, and really take stock of their own learning with a growth mindset. So that's not a simple like ABC 1, 2, 3, but it is really about building on our relationship with our kid, being there for them, you know, as much as we can with a good dose of empathy, but also understanding and helping them be accountable for any mistakes they may have made.
I have a bunch of questions. So this is one where we're going to shift over to a different stakeholder group, tech platforms, right? So this takes up a lot of our room. So I'm going to drop it off pretty soon so it doesn't block our faces. But just talking about the insights that both of you might have around how tech platforms might be able to educate or warn teens around risky behavior without being overly punitive, while also supporting a safe experience for teens. And I think this is the tension that I really noticed with a lot of questions and comments coming through of this kind of spectrum between being paternalistic and protective, right? That's our natural idea. We want to protect just individuals in general versus kind of empowering. And I think tech platforms kind of struggle with that as well. So what do you both see as the role of tech platforms? Then I actually have a scenario that I'm going to bring up that I think is really kind of hits home. I think this point.
Okay, well, I really appreciate this question. And I'll just say one thing is, I think we need, especially like the adults in the room who are even thinking about asking those questions, need a better understanding of why kids are taking risks. And is it actually a lack of understanding about what the risks are that is the reason they're doing something that's risky, or are there other factors at play? I think that was one of the clearest things that we saw, was that actually awareness about the risks was not an inoculation against taking them for teens in many different circumstances. So really bringing teens to the table and trying to unpack risky decision-making with them, I think, is a key first step. And then certainly where the gaps exist and where there are clear strategies, there are ways I think different platforms are thinking about embedding experiences where teens can learn different strategies they can take, or learn more about features, or do kind of like checkups for themselves. But I think that we're bound to fall short if we assume that just awareness of the risks and just education about what the risks are will mitigate harms to teens. Like that, just developmentally, we know that's not true, but also like so many complex social pressures often at play.
Love that.
Which shouldn't let us off the hook. It should just mean we have teens at the table for these conversations.
Definitely. Well, here's the question that I have, and then I see one coming in from Ann Collier, which I think is directly on point. But a scenario that I've had to kind of grapple with a little bit is around the perception that we take around even teen sexuality. And I'll unpack that a little bit, right? So let's imagine a scenario where a female teen, let's say 16 years old, posts a photo that a adult says, well, this is sexually provocative. But when you ask the 16-year-old, the 16-year-old says, this isn't sexually provocative. So we have to determine as a society, do we take the kind of classic kind of male gaze that is utilizing an interpretation of that teen's pose and clothing kind of options to view that through a sexual light? Or do we take it through the prism and perception of that teen and their own viewpoint on sexuality? So it seems like we sometimes, even platforms, have a choice of, are they going with what the teen perceives as appropriate, or are they going with what an adult views? And that really seems to have a blind spot of, well, I find that sexual. Well, then who's really at fault? Do we, like it seems to be a really kind of thorny topic.
I think what you're getting at, David, is interesting, and I think that you're drifting into the question of when a platform decides something is inappropriate and needs to be taken down because it's tagged or labeled as maybe something that like would be more appropriate for a porn site versus Instagram, and that can capture a gap between the perception of the person moderating the content and the perception posting the content. So in some ways, like, if we look at our Instagram feeds, and especially the Instagram feed of my teen daughter, I see that and wonder the same kinds of questions. But I think that I would lean back to what you were implying there about the importance of understanding. Like, we always in our work are really guided by what's going on for the teens and what their perspective and thinking is, and what their hopes and aspirations. Not that they don't need guidance and an understanding of how a particular photo could be interpreted by someone as conveying a message that they don't intend to convey. So we need to be there for them in that way, but also really understand that the ways in which I know for my own teen daughter, there are norms that, are present in her social media life and larger community around the display of the female body and what that's all about. And to them, that's not always sending the message that others may receive. So trying to really approach these kinds of conversations with understandings of teens' perspectives versus harsh judgments and censorship as our knee-jerk response.
Well said, Carrie. So for our final kind of question, I'll just tee it up with Ann's kind of question around, like, what do we see as potential solutions? So for Carrie and for Emily, I'm going to just utilize this as an opportunity to kind of say, like, what do you view as positive kind of next steps? Where is this going? And then also, where can people stay in touch with your work? Where can they buy your book? Where can they find you kind of on tour? I've seen you all over the map speaking about this. So Ann's question is talking about the idea of a U.S. social media helpline, something that I know that she had worked on over the last decade, and it's done in UK and Europe as well. So for both Carrie and Emily, use Ann's kind of question as a jumping off point of, you can either comment on that, but also, what do you see as like next steps? Where should this issue go? What does improvement look like? And then finally, where can people stay in touch with your incredible work?
I'll jump in first and say, I mean, I love the idea of a social media helpline, and I love Anne. I know Anne, and I know the wonderful work that she has done to promote this. And I'll just add that we hear from teens, and we've had in our teen advisory councils young people who are part of helplines that are teen moderated. So there's an organization called Teen Line that was actually founded by someone who went to the Harvard Graduate School of Education and worked briefly on our project. And we've heard again and again that conversations between teens and turning to teens as peer mentors is incredibly powerful. So I love the idea of a social media helpline for schools and families, and teen-specific helplines where they can receive support from trained and well-equipped other teens who may feel like, they're more relatable and be there for them in the ways that teens need. Emily, what would you add?
And thank you for the question. Thank you for your work in this space and your advocacy. I think yes, and like particularly the opportunities for community building. One of the things we've been so struck by is just how quickly the dilemmas are evolving and how much we need not just frankly like one person to be able to give us an expert opinion, but community spaces where we can unpack and think through dilemmas as they come up together. We were just talking to an educator who was talking about like just the total shift around. It used to be that I'll call your parents was like a big threat, and now all of a sudden, if a teacher is wanting to give a detention in her school, she's seeing that the kid is like, has their mom on FaceTime, like advocating on their behalf. And that principal is now like many of her mentors who came before her and who gave her advice about lots of different things, like they didn't deal with that particular pain point and issue. So really thinking about how we can also create networks for people to really unpack and think through these new dilemmas as they're coming up with support. I think a hotline is one really great model, and we need many of them. We need many more of these conversations and spaces for them. You can find out more about our work and our book at behindtheirscreens.com. One way to start building community, we have a reader's guide, and I just was at a local public school that was doing parent discussion groups, and you know what, they had me come in, but their favorite part of the whole event was hearing from other parents in their community and having space to talk about some of these pain points together. So there's a reader's guide on the site if you're interested, and we hope you'll use it and bring these conversations to your own communities.
I love that. So Carrie and Emily, really appreciate the incredible work that you're doing and also coming on today's live stream. This is just the start of many continuous conversations. Saw a lot of comments around kind of the need for these types of workshops that you hinted at, Emily. So do reach out to Carrie and Emily about their book, Behind Their Screens, What Teens Are Facing and Adults Are Missing. So thank you all for attending today's live stream with All Tech is Human. I'm David Ryan Polgar. And again, thank you, Carrie and Emily. Thank you all.
Thanks for having us.